Hi folks, the main point of this video is to compare the views of Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. What I wanted to do first though is show how prescient Dostoevsky was in anticipating so many other ideas from famous philosophers or other thinkers. Here's just a comparison of some of the ideas that he anticipated in Freud. Freud, of course, came about 30 years after Dostoevsky, and apparently Freud said something like The Brothers Karamazov is the greatest novel ever written. I don't agree with Freud about much, but I guess I agree with him about that point. For example, the idea that our unconscious thoughts and motivations, Freud's signature famous concept, is something that is seeded throughout Dostoevsky, and especially in the character of Ivan, who is always wrestling and asking himself, why am I doing this? Why am I saying that I'm going to leave town and go to Moscow? Am I abetting this crime? Do I want to kill my father, etc.? Him coming to grips with his own unconscious is a central theme of Dostoevsky. We don't see it very much in these readings, but it's really deeply part of the novel, so I invite you to check that out. Another idea, childhood memories are one of the fundamental drivers of Freud's entire psychology. There's a quote on page 698 that's too long, I didn't include it here, that really talks about this in depth. So the idea that what happens in our childhood can be really central to our later fate in life, that was one of Freud's key thoughts. But just the very idea for Dostoevsky that salvation oftentimes comes from memories, connections to others got through memories, and connected to our past as we build this story about ourselves. This happens through the events of childhood and memory, and this is another Freudian idea. Of course, I mean, it's like he got everything of Freud first. It almost feels like Freud was just pulling this stuff out of Dostoevsky. The Oedipus complex, Ivan even says, who doesn't wish for his father's death? Which apparently is one of the reasons why Freud really loved this novel. I mean, it's all about this Oedipal struggle. I'm not dwelling on Freudian readings of Dostoevsky, in part because I think Dostoevsky himself is way more insightful than Freud is, but there's so many interesting ways in which his thought intersects with Freudian psychology. Let me talk about somebody else, Kierkegaard. I'm just going to give you a quick adumbration of it here, and then we're going to look at the details more. The idea of unconditional commitments is something that's already come up. Dmitri and Grushenka find a relationship in which it is all defining. It gives them all of their purpose in life. There's many Kierkegaardian elements to it, although I think we're also going to see some differences. Smerdyakov's relationship to Ivan is deeply Kierkegaardian. I mean, it fits Kierkegaard to the letter. In a sense, what Dostoevsky recognizes is that these unconditional commitments aren't necessarily so positive. They could also be deeply troubling and negative, something that Kierkegaard, I think, was aware of, but really doesn't dwell on. This is something that Dostoevsky does even better in The Brothers Karamazov, is show you the danger here. And the relationship between Smerdyakov and Ivan adds so much depth to the story, especially these dark sides of psychology. Let me just give you one of my other favorite tidbits that connects Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky has this amazing description of Alyosha's character after he is crushed by the death of Zosima, or I guess he's more precisely crushed by everybody's reaction to the stink following the death of Zosima. And what happens is he has this great grief. And this is so much like Kierkegaard, I think, gives us the most deep philosophy of grief of any of these thinkers. But Dostoevsky, what he says here really is so similar to some of the things Kierkegaard says. You know, how this state of grief deeply moved him to his very soul. His heart was shaken. And he is now wearing, because of this grief, the strongest sort of armor against any sort of temptation. This just makes me think every time I read it of this passage from Kierkegaard about the night of resignation and what the ways in which that is a metaphor for the process of grief. He says the thread, the shirt worn by the night of resignation is thread spun with tears, bleached by tears, sewn with tears. And then it's also better protection than iron and steel. I mean, this is so incredibly similar and I think deeply insightful of human psychology. Kierkegaard adds the line, which is perhaps my favorite, which is this, that the secret in life is everybody must sow that for themselves. Nobody can do it for you. So there's a lot of connections to Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. I'm just going to say one more thing about Dostoevsky's relationship with Nietzsche, because this is coming up next. Of course, I should have said this before with Freud, but Freud himself acknowledged that many of his ideas come from Nietzsche too. So there's really a network of connections here. But what is so wild is once we're going to do Nietzsche in a week, so we'll see this. You can't see it yet, but Dostoevsky's character of Ivan is almost Nietzsche. It is basically Nietzsche. I mean, he literally says some things that Nietzsche says, like, you know, talking about the death of God, and if God is dead, everything is permitted. There's this one line from Dostoevsky, from Ivan. He says, "What is conscious? I make it up for myself. Then why do I suffer? It's just out of habit. And it's a human habit built up for thousands of years. And all we have to do is get out of this, and then we shall be gods." This is just thoroughly Nietzschean. Nietzsche, in fact, later titled one of his books Beyond Good and Evil, where he says exactly this, that human morality and the concepts of good and evil are just a human fiction that we've developed over several thousand years. And what we need to do is become gods and dictate values for ourselves. Once we become the creators of values, that's going to be his message. So the fate of Ivan and the character of Ivan are so thoroughly Nietzschean. What we're going to have to keep an eye out for is, are there ways in which Nietzsche can provide some of a response for the state of damnation that Ivan ends up in Dostoevsky's worldview? Or we're really going to see some interesting dialogue between these thinkers. Now Kierkegaard was 30 years older than Dostoevsky, and they did not know each other's work. Nietzsche was 20, 30 years younger than Dostoevsky and did know his work, although very slightly. So we're going to actually get to see some of this in real detail, what they think of each other. So Nietzsche and Freud were close, similar in age, although Freud was still a little bit older than Nietzsche. Now, let's come on to the comparison between Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, because part of what we're going to do in this course is put these philosophers in dialogue with each other so that we can really draw some lessons and extract our understanding of the human condition out of it. So what I want you to do here is pause your videos. I've given you two dimensions, two axes here, sort of social versus individual sources of meaning, and natural versus religious sources of meaning. And what I want you to do is see if you can figure out where you would place Kierkegaard. So pause your videos now and place Kierkegaard somewhere. Okay, I really mean you to think about this. I mean, this is where I would place him. I think Kierkegaard clearly develops his philosophy in spiritual religious terms. It's coming to have faith is the fundamental concept for the highest form of human living. So I think he is a deeply religious spiritual thinker. Although, like I said, there are existentialized readings of him, which I think are quite insightful. And so if you place Kierkegaard further over here in the middle of this axis, I can understand why, because the ways in which he recovers the temporal, and he doesn't put the meaning in the afterlife, but in this life, then if you place him over here, I think that makes perfect sense too. Now what I want you to do, pause your videos again and tell me where you're going to put Dostoevsky. Okay, that was your chance. So I think Dostoevsky, in a sense, occupies the opposite corner, or, well, no, not the opposite corner, directly above Kierkegaard, because he also uses the spiritual religious terminology. He puts his worldview in deeply Christian terms. Though, like Kierkegaard, I said the same thing about the existentialized reading of him. So again, if you thought Dostoevsky went right here, there's ways in which I would agree with that too. Partly it depends on what we mean by their use of religion and spirituality, whether or not we mean this in metaphorical terms or in necessarily literal terms. If you're reading this as in metaphorical terms, as I do, then he clearly goes here, because that is the set of symbols and metaphors he uses it. If you mean it more in absolutely literal terms, then I could see putting him here. Both of those are defensible. Now, let's talk about some of the details and comparisons with Kierkegaard. We've mentioned a few things already. What I want you to do is pause your videos and see what else you've mentioned, you've noticed. What are some of the other things besides those relationships that we've talked about? Or what are some of the details you can flesh out to it? So in order to really get something out of these videos, I think it's important to pause them and think about this for yourself for a minute. Okay, that was your last chance to pause your videos. You face the existential choice. Are you going to participate in this, or are you going to just be a bystander? As we'll see when we read some Sartre, is you have to seize freedom and engage actively in the world, not just be a passive bystander. So I hope maybe I've given you some existential guilt to pause your videos now. Here's some answers. So they both talk about the importance of feelings, and that they have these sort of ecstatic feelings of rapture. We see this throughout in Dostoevsky. I mean, people are experiencing rapture left and right once things really, the ball gets rolling in the action. And Kierkegaard talks a lot about the senselessness or the madness behind his characters of faith and resignation, but especially the character of faith and the kind of absurdity in which the person acts and realizes in the nature of the world that is the foundation of the nature of the world. I think there's a lot of connection between these wildly extreme feelings between both characters. How in some ways it's sort of mystical, and that connects with this idea about the understanding. How we can't really communicate it that easily. This was a central theme of Kierkegaard. And Dostoevsky also talks about how hard it is to explain. You know, Markel couldn't really put into words and convey to others the nature of his feelings and the joy and the concept of forgiveness that made sense to him. And Zosima says the same thing. All the characters who get in this kind of state of salvation do admit there are limitations to the way in which they can explain it. It is necessarily passionate. So you can't just, if you buy this duality between passion and reason, which I actually think we should deconstruct, and I don't buy it. So that's why I put rationality in quotes here, scare quotes. But on that way of thinking anyway, you know, it's not just reason that's going to get you there. You can't just be an intellectual philosopher like Ivan and come to the understanding, get in touch with the spiritual side of your soul that makes you human. It has to do with feelings necessarily and passions, being passionately involved in the world. You have to dive in there. You have to seize the day in order to understand what both Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are saying. Finally, there's several lines about how we need a solution to human existence. I actually didn't even put it in here. Look at page 307 in Dostoevsky, where they talk about, the character says, you need to heal your soul. And this is precisely the idea that I've been tracking in both thinkers, that we do have this conflicted nature and we require healing. And just to put it in Christian terminology, we need salvation. And that salvation, that form of redemption that we all need, can't just come from us. We have to get it in relation to something. It is deeply relational. Now, I think this is also something that we find in Kierkegaard, the idea that redemption or the most authentic way of living does come from outside of us. This is Kierkegaardian and Dostoevskian, but there's a difference in the way in which they think about it. For Kierkegaard, it doesn't necessarily involve community. In fact, it's most fundamentally a deeply individualistic act that leads to these breakdowns of communication or understanding. This is central to his discussion of the teleological suspension of the ethical. So there's ways in which there's commonality, that there is something necessarily triangular, something outside of us, which gets us into the right relation to the world or reconciles us to existence so that we find redemption. But the way in which it works for Dostoevsky through love and community, I think, is going to be deeply different. So we need to dwell on that a little bit. Okay, I mean, I could just go on. One other thing you might have thought of is this concept of eternity and time, the way in which both of them want us to unify the infinite and the temporal, and somehow we can make sense of this, make some synthesis between these conflicting polar opposites or these tendencies that are in tension. We recognize at one time that we live finite temporal lives and full of contingency, and yet at the same time, we want our lives to have infinite meaning, as if we are destined to do certain things. We are fated to live in a certain way. If you think about it, that doesn't make sense. If you're the cold, hard rationalist thinking clear-headedly, it's just silly metaphors to talk about being fated to end up with a certain person or to be pursuing some cause in one's life. But nonetheless, if you're living most authentically for them, you ought to buy into those metaphors and live your life as if you were fated to do it. This is the sort of wonderful way in which we can get eternity and time. In some ways, I think it's a very beautiful vision of human authenticity that they both share. And then finally, the idea that they both share that I've been talking about, this existentialized set of symbols, there is a way in which they are neither one of them is really for traditional conceptions of Christianity on which the afterlife is full of infinite significance and the kingdom of heaven is some other place you're going to go after you die, but rather they have a complete redemption of the temporal in our lives on earth. And that ties in with the way of living that is not ascetic, because that asceticism is really tied to those otherworldly trends. We'll talk about that even more, although I've spoken about it in some of the other videos. Now, I mentioned a couple of slight differences between them. I want you to think more about what highlights the difference between Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky the most. So let's keep this dialogue going, but think about some differences that we could talk about. So maybe pause your videos here again and see if you can try to answer this. Okay, now we're going to talk about the answers. This theme from the previous slide about love and community, this is the fundamental difference. And I didn't even give you the passages in Kierkegaard that emphasize the most the deep isolation that the person of faith experiences for Kierkegaard. But it's really throughout his work. So Kierkegaard has another book, Attack on Christendom, where he pursues this in almost frightening clarity. So read some of these passages I'm giving you. The spiritual man differs from us mere mortal men in being able to endure isolation. And his rank as a spiritual man is proportionate to his strength for enduring isolation. Now, we die or in despair if we are not reassured by being in the herd or of the same opinion as the herd. Now, this is sort of a reassuring thought. Like every one of us has that realization at some point, I think, in high school, that sort of pursuing social status is a treacherous game. And there are ways in which we retreat into, social groups because it is hard to be an individual and stand alone. Well, Kierkegaard basically built that experience of being a teenager into an entire philosophy. And he was deeply isolated and individualistic to the end. In fact, he said he wanted carved on his gravestone that individual. So he lived that difficult experience, and he recognizes that if you're finding meaning in that kind of experience, it is deeply hard. That's why he has such an amazing philosophy of grief, and his work about the Night of Resignation, I think, is really interesting and insightful. But nothing could be as anti-Dostoevskian as this. Like, in a sense, this talk about enduring isolation is precisely the mark of how spiritual you are. That is so opposite of Dostoevsky. If you just read that, you could hardly believe they have so much in common. They're like Ivan and Alyosha. If you look at the surface of them, they look absolutely diametrically opposed, and yet they share so much sort of from a spiritual point of view at the same time. So for Dostoevsky, the interest, the ability to endure isolation, even the fantasy that you could endure isolation is the greatest form of despair. That is, in a sense, the position of hell and the devil in Dostoevsky's metaphysical, worldview. So this is precisely the world of Ivan and Smerdyakov, which comes up for the greatest condemnation in Dostoevsky's mind. Just so you didn't think I was cherry picking some random quotes, I'll just give you a couple little tidbits. Look at what he's saying about the message from the New Testament. The Christianity of the New Testament is reckoned upon this idea of isolation of the spiritual man. Christianity in the New Testament consists of God in hatred to man, in hatred to oneself, in loving God. So again, we have the same idea. You probably can't be Christian at all if you give up on the concept of love that is so central to the New Testament message. But what love means in Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard is radically opposed. You have to love God, and this is the night of faith. In hatred to man oneself, there's actually a lot of precedent. Kierkegaard can pull out all sorts of passages of the Bible in which this really comes to the fore. So you must turn your back on your father and mother, your own children, your wife. This is deeply isolating. But if you are to have faith on this version of Christianity, and there's a whole lot of threads, seeds of this in the texts, the foundational texts of Christianity, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that for Kierkegaard, this element of isolation and negativity is something he really emphasizes. But this couldn't seem more opposite to the way in which Dostoevsky thinks about the concept of love. So he says, Dostoevsky has this, one of my favorite lines, love is the teacher, but you have to know how to acquire it. This elaboration is my favorite part. And the way you acquire it for Dostoevsky is you precisely eschew isolation. You must find other people who are going to enable it. That is his entire worldview. So there are ways in which Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard share so much and yet end up so different. And that's what makes them such interesting existential characters. We really do face an interesting choice as to which of them we find more compelling. So Dostoevsky says you can't do this alone. Like for Kierkegaard, the right relationship to God is possible in absolute isolation. And for Dostoevsky, that makes no sense. You need relationality. You need community. It only takes two of you. You don't have to find a whole church full. Two of you alone, in a sense, can make a metaphorical church if you know how to do it, to get in the right relationship, to forgive and acknowledge each other in a deep enough manner. Yeah. So this one other point about, to counter the negativity of Kierkegaard, so many lines of Dostoevsky are about the beauty and the joy. The countenance here that we get of spiritual fulfillment is in many ways so different than Kierkegaard's. So this is where we are so far in the course, and I think if this all makes sense to you, then great. We're making real progress here. You're learning real deep things about what some of the most difficult thinkers in the history of the Western tradition really do think. And if you've got an understanding of them, then you can start to make up your own mind. Which of these people do you find more compelling? Is the highest form of human life one in which you find a life-defining purpose that gives you this fundamental meaning? Or is the most authentic form of life to find some kind of social connectedness? And that is what deep, true human happiness comes about in. Now that you get it a little bit and you see what's at stake and you see some of the similarities and differences, you can start to make up your own mind. Maybe, and this is the thing that I think is really interesting. Maybe there is no one human condition. Maybe Kierkegaard helps you create a narrative and meaning in your life, and Dostoevsky helps create a meaning and narrative in somebody else's life. I think that's that kind of pluralism is something none of these thinkers are quite comfortable with, but in ways I think it makes a lot of sense and actually can be true to some of their fundamental motivations too, which I'll talk about in later videos. So the point of this video was to now, once you have enough grasp of what Dostoevsky thinks, we can put him in dialogue with Kierkegaard, and we can really start to appreciate the ways in which they are so similar and also so distant at the exact same time. Okay, thanks.